Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Swan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in South African tax. And I try to keep the episodes short enough that you can listen to them whenever you've got a few minutes to spare. Now, today's topic may or may not eventually be linked to the budget, but the idea comes from the budget. So I think at this point it's fairly well known, hopefully most of you are aware of it, that we were supposed to have a budget in February, and that's been postponed to March because of the fact that the parties in the governing coalition or the government of national unity couldn't agree on the proposed increase in the VAT rate, the 2% increase. Now, if you've been looking at the media, you may have seen that there's some writings or writers suggesting that there should be no VAT increase. There's been talk of a 1%, a 0.75%, so we really don't know yet. But what I would like to discuss in today's episode is if the VAT rate changes, what do you need to look at from the perspective of a VAT vendor who has to administer this VAT change? So I'm not talking about, and I'm not even going to attempt to talk about the economic effect on a consumer and those kind of things. That is far outside what I should be commenting on. Right, so if we're looking at it from a vendor's perspective, if we first look at output tax, we've got a section specifically dealing with how this transition would work. So that is section 67A of the VAT Act. Now, that section provides for an effective date that would be announced. So those of you who were around with the previous increase from 14 to 15% would know that at that point it was announced in February that the rate would increase with effect from 1 April. And the Section 9 timing rules would start to become very important then as to what can happen around before and after this effective date. Now, Section 67A makes provision for really two scenarios if you look at it carefully. And what this provision does is to provide clarity, but also to prevent manipulation, is to add another factor into the equation. So you've got the Section 9 timing rules, but then this section also requires you to look at when goods were provided, so actually delivered, or when a service was actually rendered. And you could have a scenario where the actual supply happens before the effective date, but the time of supply, if you look at Section 9, happens afterwards, or vice versa, that you've got the time of supply happening under Section 9 before the change, and the actual supply only happens, the physical delivery only happens after the effective date. So in the context of what does that physical transaction look like? In the context of goods, it refers to the goods being delivered, or in the case of services, the services actually being rendered. Now, the first scenario that the law deals with is where the goods are provided before the increased date. So in other words, or the service is rendered before that date. So let's call it the actual real delivery happens before that date, but the time of supply is only afterwards. So then the rule says we go back to the old rate, unless you're looking at rentals or periodic supplies that you then need to apportion. So it could, in some cases, perhaps be that when the actual supply took place, you didn't know about the rate, the increased rate, but then once you receive payment or you make issue the invoice, then you would be aware of the rate. So the rule there is the old rate. There is an exception for fixed property where the time of supply rules would continue to apply. And then the other side of the equation is where we've got goods or services that are deemed to be supplied in a period that starts from from the announcement to the effective date. So in other words, once we know that there's a change in the rate, where if you look at the Section 9 triggers for time of supply, those triggers are activated so that the Section 9 time of supply happens in this period. But the provision of the goods or services, the actual delivery of the goods or the rendering of the services, only happens more than 21 days after the effective date. In that case, the supply for rate purposes will be deemed to happen on the effective date. So what that then means, you can't quickly go and invoice a few things while the rate is still at 15%, knowing that it might go up to 16 or 17 if you followed the normal order of business of first actually doing the supply and then issuing an invoice or requesting payment. Now, so that prevents manipulation. There is an exception for this rule to say that if you invoice or make payments or receive payments, if your customary business practice is to invoice upfront and then render the service, or receive payment and then render the service, there is an exception to this rule. The last provision of Section 67A I would like to share with you just deals with the sale of dwellings. So in other words, residences where people would normally live. And there's a specific rule there to say that whatever the date was when the agreement was concluded, that is the rate that would apply. Now, important, and I think I've alluded to it, is that these rules relate to the rate. They don't relate to when the supply takes place. So in other words, in what VAT period it needs to be accounted for. Lastly, before I conclude, I would just like to talk about input tax. So obviously, seeing that you've got 5 years to claim input tax after the supply had been made, there would be instances where if the goods or services were supplied before the effective date, you would have still paid VAT at the old rate, although you are claiming the input tax in a VAT return that relates to a period after the effective rate. So from a systems perspective, you would need to have certain controls in place to make sure that you're claiming your input tax at the right rate at which the goods or services were supplied and the VAT that was actually charged on those supplies. Right, so in summary, from the output perspective, if the rate were to change, you need to consult Section 67A of the VAT Act. From an input side, you need a clear plan and a system to make sure you claim at the correct input rates. That's it for today's episode. If you've got any questions or comments, you're welcome to send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and tell all your friends and colleagues about it. And just a reminder, as always, the podcast is for information purposes only. It's not intended to be tax advice or a replacement for fact-specific tax advice. Until next time, goodbye.